Welcome to part two of week three, Remixing the Real, Found Footage, Collage, and the Archive. In this second half of the lecture, there's approximately four parts. The first is a somewhat brief note on the phenomenology of non-fictional film experience. Then we will discuss Heron Faroki and Andrzej Ujika's Videograms of a Revolution. Then Adam Curtis's Bitter Lake, and finally our questions and discussion. So we're returning to Jamie Barron's article, The Archive Effect, Archival Footage as an Experience of Reception, to take up a couple of her references to the film theorist Vivian Sobchak, who discusses the nature of viewing documentaries, what she calls a phenomenology of non-fictional film experience. And according to Sobchak, the term documentary designates more than a cinematic object. Along with the obvious nomination of a film genre characterized historically by certain objective textual features, the term also, and more radically, designates a particular subjective relation to an objective cinematic or televisual text. In other words, documentary is less a thing than an experience, and the term names not only a cinematic object, but also the experienced difference and sufficiency of a specific mode of consciousness and identification with the cinematic image. So this is very basically a phenomenological approach to the reception of the documentary or the reception of the cinematic image and how it can become or is received by the spectator as being a documentary as opposed to, let's say, a fiction film. Now, on that tip, Sobchak outlines, drawing from the French theorist Jean-Pierre Mounier's three modes of spectatorial consciousness and intentionality in terms of attending to images and whether or not they're taken as documentary or two other modes. So for Sobchak, Meunier first identifies of his three spectatorial forms of consciousness and intentionality the home movie, or what in French is termed the film souvenir, which is something viewed as something personal, specific, to the viewer's particularity, right? So when the viewer watches a home movie, for example, they will see my dog, their dog, my family, or perhaps even myself. And so this home movie is really a document of my world, and it's very intimate and close. And in this sense, intriguingly, from Meunier, the idea of seeing one's own world and perhaps one's own self or one's family um, in the film image is that it has a strong sense of pastness, right? In cinema, as a recording, it is something represented, and it has this quality of pastness, which will also relate it to things like nostalgia. The second category is the documentary film, which has a more impersonal relationship to the viewer than the home movie. And in this way, it is more general and more abstract. It is lacking some of the specificity of the home movie, but it is nevertheless showing the world, but it is a world that is indirectly given to the spectator. And third, Sobchak identifies with Meunier the fiction film, and in this case, in the reception of the fiction film, the object is otherwise, as it were, unknown to me in its specificity. I only know it, whatever is represented on the screen, through this fiction film. It is a world that is presented to me, not necessarily or not the world, but in this sense. The viewer in Sobchak's reading is therefore all the more drawn to the image for this very reason, right? The viewer depends upon the image in this way and intends the image in this way as an experience of a world. Now, we should note, following Sobchak, that these categories are not entirely fixed or stable. So, for example, one person's home movie can become another's documentary. And hopefully, we can see in some of the following examples from Videograms of Revolution and perhaps also Bitter Lake that these different modalities of uh, spectatorial consciousness and intentionality will operate. Um, could operate, all three of them could operate at the same time in any given way of documentary, of any watching of any documentary film. Now, finally, concluding with Sobchak, I also would like to quote something that Barron takes up, another essay of Sobchak's entitled The Charge of the Real, Embodied Knowledge and Cinematic Consciousness, in which Sobchak writes, however weighted on the side of social consciousness and convention, our actual viewing experiences are best described as containing both documentary and fictional moments co-constituted by a dynamic and labial spectatorial engagement with all film images. And although the nature of these moments may be cued, structured, and finally contained by conventional cinematic practices, ultimately it is our own extra cinematic, cultural, and embodied experience and knowledge that governs how we first take up the images we see on the screen and what we make of them. So, of course, right, films will be structured in all sorts of ways to, present to us a intentional meaning, right? And they will have all sorts of conventions in place. We can think of continuity editing and so forth in fiction films, but also in documentaries that observe many of the stylistic strategies of fiction films. That will, cue us and in many ways delimit and control the types of meanings we can and values and ways that we can approach a film. But nevertheless, at least according to Sobchak, we are ultimately, it is extra cinematic, cultural, and embodied experience and knowledge that at least partially determines how we receive and view a given film. Okay, so with all of this in mind, we can turn to Videograms of a Revolution. Um, Videograms of a Revolution was released in 1992, and of course, it chronicles 5 days of the Romanian Revolution in December 1989. The film is culled from approximately 125 hours of footage, and it moves from camera to camera, from state television to handheld citizens operating cameras and everything in between to create a kind of assemblage film about the nature of the revolution and its capture in images at the time. Now, I asked you to read Ava Kernbauer's essay, Establishing Belief, and she writes, Videograms of a Revolution is essentially a documentary. 106 minutes of material filmed in Timisoara and Bucharest during the revolution and broadcast on Romanian TV are arranged in exact chronological order and structured by 19 inserts and several voiceover comments. The images that were actually shown on TV are marked by a series of inserts that help the viewer follow the course of the revolution. Videograms of Revolution thus functions both as a reconstruction of the revolution and a deconstruction of its politics of representation. The term videograms suggests automatic recording without interruption, and while the names of the people who had actually been filming are scrupulously documented in the credits, in the film itself, the images often appear authorless. But she goes on, within this context of media theory debate over the image and authenticity, reference, and credibility, and while subjecting the material to deconstruction, Videograms of Revolution paradoxically asserts the role of images as agents of historical documentation. So what Kernbauer is referring to here in the sense of this context, there's the context in which this film was made and being about the Romanian Revolution, but also surrounding this in debates, intellectual debates by media theorists and philosophers like Jean Baudrillard and Paul Virilio, amongst others, who debated the nature of this revolution and its capture as and in images at the time in the late 80s and early 90s. And for Kernbauer, Heron Faroki and Andrei Yuzhika we're very aware of this context of media debate and the question of spectacle, media spectacle, and its relationship to the revolution. But she argues that their work also sidesteps some of these debates in order to construct um, its own narrative about belief and authenticity in relationship to the images of the revolution. So let us take a look at the second scene of the film if we following the opening titles. Before the titles, I'll quickly mention there is a shot of a woman who is injured, who speaks directly to the camera about the necessity of the revolution and her hopes for it. Then we have the opening title of the film, and then we have this sequence, which we will watch now.
In mid-December 1989, demonstrations had broken out in Temeshvar. Protests were aimed at first at government plans to banish Pastor Laszlo Tükes from the city, then at Ceausescu. On December 17th, members of the Securitate, militia, and army opened fire on demonstrators. The victims were taken away. Their whereabouts remained unknown. 2 days later, tens of thousands of people took to the streets as if they had nothing to lose. In reports which circulated, the number of those who had died continued to rise. General expectancy, the certainty of evil, created a pattern of perception in which the corpses of a pauper cemetery could be confused with those of the rebellion. At the time and place inscribed in the image, from the window of a student dormitory in Temeshvar, an amateur video camera records demonstrators moving towards the center of the city. The camera is in danger. It has remained upstairs to continue filming. Crowd chants reverberate, at times clearly discernible. The image in the blue, wintry light is divided. The walls in the foreground and the action in the background pertain to different temporal frames. The image is unequally divided. The major portion is occupied by the foreground, which is not the focus of attention. The event has been shifted to the background. The camera gets as close to the event as the lens allows.
So, among other things, what we have here in Videograms of a Revolution in this early scene is with the expository narration, the film becomes a kind of forensic analysis of the image, that is to say, the situated image, its parameters, and method of capture. And so we have what, at the time, in the moment, during the revolution, was effectively a kind of verite participatory portrait of the revolution. What we have then with the addition of the impersonal voiceover that recontextualizes and analyzes the image, a kind of a further sense of analysis. And then this image will be put into dialogue with many other fragments of images captured throughout the 5 days of the revolution, including that of Ceausescu's last speech on state television, which we will turn to in a moment. Now, returning to some of Eva Kernbauer's argument, we can bring to bear on this sequence that we just watched some of her comments, including those such as when she argues that the film shows different attempts to process, interpret, or to explain the actual events not discernible on the recordings. So we see something that was real in this image, But without the contextualizing voiceover for us as viewers in the way that we can attend to the image, we arguably would be rather lost and really not know what it is that we're looking at. And so often the cameras seem utterly useless, according to Kernbauer, in documenting what actually happened. The knowing, informed eye, also represented by the director's commentary, as I said, is necessary to analyze them. The use of the camera then can be interpreted either as highly naive or highly dramatic, or both, with the belief that if the camera is aimed at something, it will be documented. No matter what is actually visible on film, the unreadable image lays open its precarious condition and protests by its inability to show, to be useful as a referent, its right to be recorded. And so basically, what Kernbauer is getting at here, especially with this last bit on page 80, is this idea that the camera is asserting its right and power to capture something of the real, or what Kernbauer refers to as the referent, but we cannot be sure, or it is not given that this referent, what is captured at the time, will be legible to a later viewing audience, right? Especially an audience such as ourselves, some 30 years at a temporal remove, right? So we have then Per Faroki and Ushika's voiceover helping to provide context and analysis for us as viewers. But we nevertheless have this footage before us.